Today we will honor the memory of Daniel Naroditsky by looking at one of his earliest masterpieces, a game he played at just 13 during the World Under-14 Championship. Daniel annotated this game in his book Mastering Positional Chess, which was published when he was only 14, making him the youngest published author in chess history. Let's dive into this game and see how young Daniel created his masterpiece. His opponent starts with d4 and Daniel plays the King's Indian defense, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. White goes for the Zemish variation, f3, reinforcing the center, taking the g4 square under control and preparing bishop e3, after which the black knight won't be able to harass the bishop by jumping on g4. After bishop e3, white is going to play queen d2, creating the queen and bishop battery, castle queenside, and start a very strong attack on the kingside by pushing the pawns forward. The bishop will invade h6, the black king by that time will castle kingside, so ideally white wants to exchange the dark squared bishop, open the h-file, and checkmate the black king. Daniel castles kingside, bishop e3 follows, and Daniel goes for the classical variation. He makes the most natural move, e5, immediately attacking white's center and threatening e takes d, and after white recaptures with the bishop, he will develop the knight with a tempo, attacking the bishop, and of course white will be forced to spend a tempo and retreat the valuable bishop, because this bishop is very important. The dark squares in white's position, as you can see, are weakened. And of course white must do something about this threat, and he has two main options. Of course, exchanging on e5 doesn't give white any advantage, because after this exchange and the possible exchange of the queens, the position is absolutely equal. So the two main options white has are either knight e2, defending the d4 pawn. So if black captures, now white will recapture with the knight, so white keeps the tension in the center, or as is the case in our game, instead of knight e2, white pushes the pawn forward, increasing his space advantage and closing the center. This pawn is very strong, it puts pressure on black's position and restricts him. So black again has many different options. He can make the standard King's Indian move, knight h5, preparing the advance of the f-pawn. Or he can play a5, for example, another standard King's Indian move, taking the b4 square under control, preventing the possible advance of the white b-pawn, and thus ensuring the c5 square for one of his knights. But in our game, Daniel goes for another variation, which is also quite popular. In the anticipation of white's long castle, he plays c6, immediately starting the counterplay on this side of the board. He wants to capture on d5 and open the c-file in order to create threats to the white king after he castles. Queen d2 follows. White creates his battery and prepares the long castle. C takes d, c takes d, a6. So Daniel continues developing his initiative on the queen side. He prepares the advance of the b-pawn. And now that black has already created some counter chances on the queen side, the c-file is open, he's ready to push the b-pawn forward, it would make sense for white to refrain from his initial idea of the long castle and the pawn storm on the king side and change his plan. Instead, it might have been better to castle kingside. So it would be better to play bishop d3, followed by knight e2, short castle, and instead of the pawn storm on the king side, white should have played actively on the queen side, because he has the space advantage on this side of the board. But instead, white sticks to his initial plan. He castles queenside. b5 follows, and here again, white makes a committal move, as Naroditsky writes in his annotations. It would be better to make the natural move, either king b1, the prophylactic move, moving the king away from the c-file, or to start the pawn storm right away with g4. But instead, and here comes the committal move, bishop d3 follows, which was a little bit dubious decision, because in these positions this bishop might also move to h3, but white commits too early. And we have reached our first critical position. So what should black do now? The natural looking b4 would be dubious because the a4 square would be weakened, the black pawn doesn't control it anymore, and white would play knight a4, attacking the b4 pawn, and the knight is threatening to invade b6, supported by the bishop, attacking the rook, the valuable light squared bishop, and all this is very unpleasant. For this reason, of course, Daniel didn't play b4. He writes that he didn't want to continue with the natural knight d7, bishop b7, rook c8, queen a5, and once the queen controls the a4 square, after that b4 is possible, because he thinks that this plan would be a little bit slow. So he finds another idea. All his pieces have great prospects, all except the one, the dark squared bishop. This bishop is bad because it's blocked by its own e5 pawn. So you can pause the video and find how Daniel activates this bishop. So to activate the bishop, as Daniel writes, black must sacrifice something on f4. And as you see the bishop, the queen controls this square. So after white captures, black will recapture with the e-pawn, opening the bishop's diagonal. White, of course, will capture the second time, winning a pawn, but the bishop's diagonal will open. And he plays knight h5. He's going to invade the f4 square, and after white captures this knight, the diagonal will be open. So how should white react? Making the prophylactic move g3 to prevent the invasion of the knight doesn't make much sense, because white is planning to move this g-pawn to g4 instead of g3. So if he plays g3, how will he continue? His main idea is g4, h4, h5, opening the h file. So white didn't play g3. Instead, he makes the move he intended to make. g4 with a tempo, attacking the knight. But now Naroditsky, of course, plays knight f4, sacrificing the pawn. Of course, it wouldn't be good for white to capture this knight right away with the bishop, because this bishop is valuable. As we know, it defends the weakened dark squares. So after e takes f, queen takes f4, of course, white is up a pawn, but black has great compensation, and he has a big positional advantage because the bishop's diagonal is open and white doesn't have dark squared bishop to challenge it. For this reason, white makes a stronger move. He wants to capture on f4 with the knight instead. He plays knight e2. Now he's ready to capture with the knight. And the engine shows that black should have captured on d3, getting the advantage of two bishops. But it's understandable that Daniel doesn't want to exchange his knight for white's bad bishop. This bishop is restricted by its own pawns, which are all placed on the light squares. For this reason, he continues his development. Knight d7, letting white capture on f4 with the knight. And that's exactly what white does, and the engine agrees with white. That's the best move, after which the engine gives a slight advantage to white. However, from human perspective, it isn't easy now to defend white's position. Of course, white is up a pawn, but now the bishop's diagonal is open and all black pieces have great prospects. But at the moment the d6 pawn is under attack, so black must do something about it. And the most natural moves that come to mind are either knight e5 or knight c5. Knight e5 probably looks even more natural, occupying the great central square, attacking the weak f3 pawn, but Daniel writes that he didn't like this because white can exchange on e5. Of course, white wouldn't have the dark squared bishop to defend his weaknesses, but still he would have eliminated one piece, the knight, and after that white can play king b1, and as we can see, black doesn't have the sufficient attacking resources to create serious threats to the white king, while white is ready to start his attack. For this reason, instead of knight e5, he plays knight c5, keeping more pieces on board and creating an immediate threat. Now that the knight controls the a4 square, black is ready to push the pawn to b4. The white knight won't be able to jump on a4, it would be forced to retreat somewhere else, let's say to e2, after which black is going to push the pawn further to b3, threatening to capture on a2, so white would be forced to play a3, trying to keep the b file closed, after which the black knight will jump on a4 and, together with the bishop, attack the b2 pawn, and it isn't clear how white is going to defend this pawn. For this reason, to parry this threat, white plays bishop e3, taking the d4 square under control. And now, if black plays b4, that would be a dubious decision, because after knight e2, so the pawn is under attack, b3, a3, and knight a4, b2 is under attack, but now we can see the idea behind bishop e3. White would play bishop d4. b2 is defended, and white is ready to exchange the pride of black's position, the dark squared bishop, and black sacrificed a pawn in order to open this bishop's diagonal. So white will simply exchange the bishops, after which black will lose the realistic chances to create threats to the white king, while the dark squares in black's position would be weakened, and black's attack will be white's attack would be very strong. For this reason, Daniel doesn't push the pawn to b4. Instead, he plays queen f6, creating the battery, not only attacking the weak f3 pawn, but creating a threat. Now he threatens to push the pawn forward, and after the knight retreats, he will simply capture on d3 with a check, and after white recaptures, the queen wouldn't defend the b2 pawn anymore, and black would checkmate the white king. So white must do something about this threat. And to parry this threat, white decides to exchange his valuable bishop for the knight. Of course, now the black bishop will dominate the dark squares. However, white's move makes sense, because black is forced to capture with the pawn, and that means the c file is closed again. Besides that, as the black pawn has disappeared from d6, the white d5 pawn turns into a passed pawn. So f3 is still under attack. So white would love to play f4, of course. f4, then e5, and his pawn center would become mobile, and this center would smash everything in its way. However, if he plays f4 right away, the g4 pawn would fall. Black would simply capture it. For this reason, instead of pushing the pawn right away, white first plays bishop e2, not only defending the f3 pawn, but also defending the g4 pawn. And now white is ready to push the pawn forward. And if he manages to do it, if he manages to play f4 and e5, of course, his center will be very strong, the bishop's diagonal would be closed, and white would get a winning position. So black must do something about this threat. First, Daniel plays b4 with a tempo, attacking the knight. Now, if the knight jumps on a4, black can simply play bishop d7, attacking the knight, and it turns out that the knight doesn't have any squares to move. b6, of course, is controlled by the queen, and if the knight captures on c5, it will get pinned, of course. Black will simply win this knight. For this reason, after b4, the knight returns to its initial square, which looks passive, of course, but white hopes to move the queen away from d2, vacating this square for the knight, after which the knight will jump on d2, the king will move to b1, and the knight will also occupy the great blockading c4 square. So we have reached another critical position. Again, white is ready to play f4, after which, as we know, he will, if he manages to do it, if he manages to play f4 and e5, he will get a winning position. So you can pause the video one more time and find how Daniel deals with this threat. To parry his opponent's threat, Daniel creates his own threats that prove to be more serious. He pushes the c-pawn forward, creating a threat of c3, destroying white's queenside and exposing his king. So if white plays f4 after c3, as you can see, white initiates the devastating attack. So white must do something about this threat. But by playing c4, Daniel lets his opponent capture any of these pawns. So he can capture b4, and he can also capture c4. And he must capture one of these pawns, otherwise c3 is unstoppable. What happens if white captures on b4? Do you see Daniel's idea? So that would be a mistake, of course, because the b file would turn into a half open file. The queen and the bishop are already eyeing the b2 pawn, and of course if the rook joins attack, and the rook will join attack, that would be deadly. At the moment black cannot play rook b8 because his rooks aren't connected, but Daniel prepared bishop takes g4. Now the rooks are connected, rook b8 is coming, and the pawn on f3 is also under attack. And if white accepts the sacrifice, then after rook b8 and the retreat of the queen, let's say to a3, black would capture, the second rook would join the attack, and black will simply have a checkmating attack. So the b4 pawn is untouchable. If white captures the c4 pawn instead, then the f3 pawn falls. On e2 the bishop was defending this pawn, so black captures on f3, the c file is open, so that was the one of the main ideas of black's c4 advance. So he wants to open files on the queen side, and both pawns are weak, so white can forget about his counterplay in the center with e5, and white's position simply collapses. Besides the attacked pawn, of course, rook c8 is also coming and black is winning. For this reason, before capturing on c4, white plays g5, kicking out the queen from f6 so that she cannot capture on f3, and only after the queen moves, Daniel moved her to d6 and black again threatens c3, so only now white captures this pawn. So white is 2 pawns up now, and again he threatens f4 and e5. To prevent this, Daniel plays bishop e5, completely blockading white's center. So white's whole position is blocked on the dark squares. So Daniel definitely has very good compensation for the 2 sacrificed pawns. Besides that, he has an immediate threat of bishop, he created an immediate threat of bishop f4, winning the queen. And the c file is also open, so after moving the bishop, rook c8 is coming. And besides that, Daniel has another attacking idea, which is a5, a4, a3, and after the elimination of the b2 pawn, the long diagonal will be completely exposed, and that would be very dangerous, very unpleasant for white. So black definitely has very good compensation for the pawns. White plays queen e2, and what should black do now? The natural looking bishop f4 check doesn't make much sense now. It isn't winning the queen. White has saved the queen. So white would make the move he intended to make anyways. He would have played knight d2, and if black captures on g5, that would be a more serious mistake, because the queen on e2 supports the e pawn, so white can play e5, breaking the blockade, and his center becomes mobile and white is almost winning. For this reason, Daniel doesn't give this useless check. Instead, he keeps increasing the pressure. a5. And we already know his intentions. Knight d2 follows, so white wants to move the king away from the open c file, and maybe if he manages to do it, the knight can also occupy the great c4 square. a4 follows, king b1, a3. Black threatens to capture on b2, and that would be deadly, of course. The pawn on b2 would be very strong, supported by the bishop. The a file would also open, so white must play b3, preventing it and trying to keep the position on the queen side as closed as possible. But now the long diagonal is completely exposed, and the black queen can also threaten to invade the a1 square besides b2 and c3. So Daniel returns the bishop to g7, vacating the e5 square for the queen, threatening deadly queen e5, after which, of course, black would get a checkmating attack. So to parry this threat, white plays king c2. Now the a1 square is defended by the rook, and after queen e5, black threatens to invade b2, and after king d3, the queen from b2 would move to c3 with checkmate. So white must defend the b2 square too. That's why rook b1 follows. So white is still 2 pawns up, but Daniel writes that white is almost paralyzed. He doesn't have any counterplay. So white cannot do anything. That's why it's time to get one of the sacrificed pawns back. Queen takes g5. And Daniel didn't just get the material back. He has an epic plan in mind, and to execute this plan, he needed to eliminate the g5 pawn. So what should white do? The only active idea he has is, of course, f4 and e5. At the moment he cannot play f4 because the black queen controls this square. That's why he prepares this advance with rook f1. Now he's ready to push the pawn forward, but of course Daniel prevents it with queen f4. Queen f2 follows. White probably hopes to play queen g3, exchanging the queens, and after that it might be easier for him to break the blockade in the center, but Daniel prevents it. Bishop h6, increasing the pressure on the knight and tying the white queen to its defense. White cannot play queen g3 now. That's why white plays rook d1, defending the knight and probably again thinking about queen g3. But queen e5 follows. Now the queen is ready to invade b2. That's why the rook returns to b1. And we have reached another critical position. White has defended his king against the immediate threats. b2 is defended. Of course, black can invade, the queen can invade the c3 square, but black doesn't achieve much because the king moves to d1 and there is no effective way to continue the attack, while white is ready to push the pawn forward. For this reason, Daniel doesn't make this obvious move, queen c3 check. The engine recommends f5 instead, in order to capture on e4 and open the f file, increasing the pressure. But instead, Daniel has in mind an epic plan that I mentioned earlier. You can pause the video and try to find this plan too. I will give you a small tip. What should you do when your opponent successfully defended on one side of the board? Try to find the answer to this question and you will find black's plan. The principle of two weaknesses. When your opponent has defended on one side of the board, you should create a second weakness on another side of the board. So that means on the king side. But what can black do on the king side? Daniel has in mind, and now we will see his epic plan, he will eliminate the h2 pawn, and not for the sake of the pawn, of course, but after the elimination of this pawn, his h-pawn will turn into a passed pawn and it will move forward. So white, besides defending the queen side and his king, will be forced also to deal with this passed pawn, and his pieces won't be able to defend both weaknesses. But if black plays in the most straightforward way, which is bishop f4, attacking this pawn for the second time, he wouldn't be able to capture this pawn anyways. Let's say after bishop f4, had it been black's turn, if he captured on h2, that would be a blunder because white would push the f pawn forward to f4, attacking the black queen and also breaking the communication between the black queen and the bishop. So the black queen after f4 would be under attack, and the bishop on h2 would also be under attack. That's why Daniel doesn't play the straightforward bishop f4. Instead, to execute his plan, he starts with a counterintuitive decision, which at first sight looks counterintuitive, bishop h3, moving the bishop away from the queen side. And it seems that black's main idea is to attack the king, and black voluntarily moves the bishop away from the queen side. But he is attacking the rook, kicking it out from f1 so that it doesn't support the possible advance of the pawn, and he fixes the h2 pawn. So the pawn cannot move forward. Besides that, the bishop has moved away from c8, vacating the c8 square for the rook. So Daniel is going to combine his play on the queen side with his play on the king side. So white must save his rook. He plays rook e1, and only now bishop f4 follows, attacking the h2 pawn for the second time. But it isn't as easy as it might look. After queen e2, it turns out that black still cannot capture the pawn. Capturing it would be a terrible blunder because the bishops are on the same file, on the h file, and by playing rook h1, white is winning one of them, attacking the dark squared bishop for the second time, and if it moves, then the light squared bishop would fall. For this reason, Daniel, of course, doesn't make this terrible blunder, and now that he increased the pressure on the king side, he returns to the queen side. The c8 square is vacated, so rook c8 follows, creating a very unpleasant x-ray. Queen d3 follows, defending the c3 square against the possible invasion of the black queen, and also eyeing the unguarded bishop. And it turns out that again black cannot capture on h2. That would be a mistake because of f4, attacking the queen and attacking the bishop. For this reason, so the light squared bishop has completed its mission. The c8 square is vacated and occupied by the rook. The f1 rook is kicked out, so now the bishop returns to the queen side, bishop d7. So now that the bishop has left the h3 square and the queen isn't x-raying it, black is ready to capture on h2. Besides that, the retreat of the bishop to d7 has another deep idea, and we will see it soon. So what should white do? Black is ready to capture this pawn and push his h-pawn forward. There is no way to defend this pawn because it's attacked twice and it isn't defended a single time. If white pushes the pawn forward, then black can at least play h5, fixing the pawn on h4, and the pawn is doomed anyways. It isn't defended, and black, if needed, can attack it in many different ways. For this reason, as the pawn is doomed anyways, white plays king d1, moving the king away from the open c-file. Daniel captures on h2 and reestablishes the material balance. Knight f1, attacking the valuable bishop. Of course, black must retain this bishop, so bishop f4 follows. Knight e3, and the h-pawn starts its march, h5. Knight g2, again attacking the bishop, and again Daniel retains the bishop, bishop h6 follows. Rook h1, white tries to stop the advance of the h-pawn, but queen g3. Attacking the knight, so the queen invades this square with a tempo, and also by controlling these squares, the queen, of course, will support the further advance of the h-pawn. However, it isn't that easy, as we will see. White resists very well. He plays knight e1, and after h4, queen e2, vacating the d3 square for the knight. h3 follows, knight d3, and the knight controls very important squares from d3. We'll see why it's so important. So we have reached another critical position. If the black pawn continues its march with h2, and now we can see the idea behind knight d3. The knight controls the f2 square, white can play queen f2, offering the exchange of the queens, and it turns out that the best thing black can do is to exchange the queens. But after the exchange of the queens, of course, black's pressure, terrible pressure, would be reduced. But black is almost forced to exchange the queens, because if he retreats the queen, let's say to g5, that would be a mistake, a terrible mistake, because the knight also controls the f4 square, and white breaks the blockade with f4, followed by e5. If instead of retreating to g5, the queen retreats to d6, then the knight also controls the e5 square, so white can push the pawn, the e-pawn forward, again with a tempo and again getting a winning position. For this reason, after h3 and knight d3, Daniel doesn't push the h-pawn forward. But how should black continue then? You can pause the video and try to find Daniel's next move. So now we can see another idea behind the invasion of the black queen on g3. She didn't just kick the g2 knight out of this square and support the advance of the h-pawn. She also controls the e1 square. And it turns out that the white king actually doesn't have many squares to move. He is also cut on this diagonal by the bishop, so the only square he has is c2, and Daniel exploits that. He temporarily sacrifices the exchange. Rook takes c4. A spectacular blow. White is forced to capture with the pawn, and now that the pawn has disappeared from b3, this diagonal becomes exposed, and the bishop, which returned from h3 to d7, and remember I told you that this retreat also has another idea, and here it comes. Bishop a4 check, and the white king doesn't have a single move. White must play rook b3. Daniel gets the exchange back, but after a takes b, another pawn, this time the a pawn, turns into a passed pawn. So white has two passed pawns. Of course, black has two passed pawns. Of course, white also has connected passed pawns in the center, but of course these pawns are far away from the promotion squares. Besides that, white's center is restrained, while the black pawns are ready to move, and Daniel immediately pushes the pawn forward, threatening to promote. And the pawn is untouchable. If the white queen captures, of course, f3 falls with a check, and white is losing the rook. That's why king c2 follows. The rook defends this square, but queen g2. Attacking and pinning the queen, also attacking the rook, so white has no choice. He must exchange the queens, after which this pawn approaches the promotion square too. So both black pawns need just one move to promote the rook. So it comes with a tempo, the rook must move, and after bishop e3, black is ready to promote to the queen. White would be forced to give up the rook, and black will capture the rook, and it turns out that after that, this pawn will also promote. There is no way white can prevent it, because if needed, black will support the pawn with the rook. The bishop from g1 can move to d4, also supporting the pawn, so black is winning. For this reason, in this position, white resigned. Thanks for watching. May Daniel's soul rest in peace.